The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963 shocked the country and raised serious national concerns about gun violence and firearm availability. Although his death did not lead immediately to strong new laws, it set in motion a long public discussion about gun regulation in the United States. Over the next few years, rising crime rates, the assassinations of other public figures, and increased public attention on firearm access created growing pressure for federal action. By the end of the 1960s, these concerns led Congress to pass one of the most significant gun laws in American history. This law was known as the Gun Control Act of 1968. It was shaped by several years of public debate, investigation, and political compromise, and it became a major turning point in how the federal government regulated firearms. Before the law was passed, the federal government had limited authority over guns. The first major federal law was the National Firearms Act of 1934, which was passed during the Great Depression in response to organized crime and gang violence. That law focused on certain types of weapons, like machine guns and sawed-off shotguns, and required registration and taxation of those firearms. In 1938, another law was passed to regulate interstate gun sales, but enforcement was weak, and there were few restrictions on who could buy guns or how they could be sold. By the 1960s, these older laws were widely considered outdated and ineffective, especially as crime increased and more modern firearms became widely available. President Kennedy had expressed interest in stronger gun laws during his presidency. In 1963, he proposed legislation to control mail-order gun purchases, because the men who killed him, Lee Harvey Oswald, had bought his rifle through the mail. However, Congress did not act on Kennedy's proposals during his lifetime. It was not until after two more major assassinations, those of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Senator Robert F. Kennedy in 1968, that Congress took more urgent action. The public response to these events created new political pressure for stronger gun laws, and lawmakers responded by moving forward with broader legislation. The Gun Control Act of 1968 was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson on October 22, 1968. The law had multiple parts and addressed several areas of concern. It focused on who could legally own guns, how guns could be bought and sold, and how the government would track firearms crossing state lines. One of its key features was the creation of a new system for federal firearm licensing. The law required anyone involved in the business of selling guns to obtain a federal license. This meant that gun dealers could be more closely monitored and held accountable for following the law. Another important part of the law was the creation of a list of people who were not allowed to own or buy guns. This included convicted criminals, people with mental illness who had been institutionalized or declared mentally incompetent by a court, drug users and addicts, people dishonorably discharged from the military, and individuals under certain restraining orders or subject to court judgments. By clearly defining these categories, the law gave federal agencies a way to identify and block certain individuals from accessing firearms. The law also restricted the importation of foreign-made guns that did not meet specific sporting criteria. This was meant to reduce the number of cheap handguns being brought into the United States, many of which were linked to violent crime. The law did not ban these firearms completely but required that they meet standards of safety and sporting use. This part of the law reflected concerns about the growing availability of small, inexpensive handguns often used in criminal acts. The Gun Control Act also made it illegal to sell firearms to people across state lines unless the sale went through a federally licensed dealer. This was an effort to close gaps in earlier laws that had allowed people to buy guns in states with weaker laws, and then bring them into states with stricter laws. By regulating interstate sales, Congress tried to create a more consistent national standard and give federal agencies more tools to enforce the law. Despite its scope, the Gun Control Act of 1968 did not include a system for background checks at the time of purchase. That feature would not be added until later, with the passage of the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act in 1993. However, The 1968 law did provide the legal foundation for later reforms by defining who was prohibited from owning guns, and by giving the federal government more power to regulate dealers and sales. The passage of the law was not without opposition. Some critics believed it went too far and violated the rights of lawful gun owners under the Second Amendment. Others believed it did not go far enough and failed to prevent the kinds of gun violence that had shocked the nation. Gun rights organizations, including the National Rifle Association, which at the time focused mainly on gun safety and marksmanship, began to shift their public stance and take a stronger position in defense of gun ownership rights. This period marked the beginning of a broader national debate over how to balance individual rights with public safety in the context of firearms. The Gun Control Act of 1968 became the main federal gun law for decades, and influenced how future laws were written and enforced. It gave federal agencies new authority to investigate and prosecute violations of gun laws. It also created new legal standards that would later be used in court cases involving the Second Amendment and gun regulation. Although the law did not solve the problem of gun violence, it changed how the federal government approached the issue and created a framework for future discussions and policy changes. Subscribe to explore more of America's history.